Hi, I'm Sandy Ogg, and just a little bit by way of introduction, I grew up in the southeastern part of Virginia and grew up in a great family. You don't get a chance to pick your parents in life, but I just got lucky, and my parents were terrific. And after I graduated high school, I decided to go to the United States Coast Guard Academy. And while I was at the academy, sports were a big part of the reason I was there. And in fact, the reason I went to the Coast Guard Academy is because the coach was Otto Graham. And Otto Graham was a Hall of Fame football player, and it attracted me to the academy. And while I was there, I had a chance to play football, I had a chance to play baseball, graduated with a degree in mathematics, and off to Alaska. And so my first assignment out of the academy was in Alaska. And I was on a rescue ship doing work in the Gulf of Alaska and out in the Bering Sea. Had a chance to learn a lot about myself, a lot about teamwork, and a lot about getting things done in a challenging environment. And after a number of years in the Coast Guard, they assigned me to the Coast Guard Leadership School. And the Coast Guard Leadership School was in its infancy, and we were setting it up. And as a result of that experience, it led me into the area of leadership development, and it shaped the rest of my life. And so when I decided to resign my commission from the Coast Guard, I joined the Center for Leadership Studies. And that was a place where I had a chance to work with some really interesting people like Marshall Goldsmith, like Paul Hersey, like Ken Blanchard. And their thinking and their approach to being able to shape and package ideas left a sort of indelible imprint on me. And so while I was at the Center for Leadership Studies, we were at that time really famous for situational leadership. It was a point of departure from thinking about leadership as traits, and that it was all about character. And traits and character were great when the world isn't moving, but at that point, the world was starting to move. And so as situations changed, we need a leadership model to help people to be able to lead in a changing environment. And at that point, compared to today, the world was moving relatively slow, but relative to the time before that, it was moving relatively fast. And so when things begin to change, new tools are required. And so I worked at the Center for Leadership Studies. I then left, founded my own firm together with a colleague. We grew it, and then we sold it, and I went to work for one of my clients, which was Motorola. And Motorola was my first role in human resources. There, we were in the process of establishing a new way of thinking about how to run Motorola, and I ended up reporting to the CEO of Motorola and running something called the Office of Leadership. And in the Office of Leadership was the first time that we really started to think about leadership as a question of supply and demand. So most of the people, when we were discussing human resources, we talked about talent, we talked about people, and and it was all supply, supply, supply. But from my point of view, having a background in mathematics and economics and so on, for me, if there's supply, there must be demand. And so what is the demand side of the equation? And in that case, we started to say, well, what are the jobs? What are the big jobs in the company? And how do we ensure that we have a reliable and effective supply for those jobs? So the job became the demand and the demand side of the equation, and the supply became the talent. And what we did, though, was we looked at the roles in the hierarchy. And in that sense, that we looked at, well, what are the top 200 jobs? And we started with the CEO, and then we went to the CEO's direct reports, and then we went to their direct reports until we got to 200. And these were the roles that the CEO was interested in. I was responsible to him, and so I became interested in those roles. And we dimensionalized those roles as to, how important were those roles relative to the future of the business. And then we looked at the top 1,000 talent, and so we began to then match the top 200 roles with the 1,000 talent. And I didn't even realize it at the time. We created an internal version of LinkedIn, which was to get everybody to put their resume online. And online 25 years ago was a new thing. So we got people to fill out a 19-page, if you can believe it, 19-page form to kind of get all of their facts and figures. And people said to me, how in the world are you going to get people to fill out a 19-page form? Well, and the answer was, I said, listen, feel free to fill out the form or don't fill out the form. If you want to be considered for the top 200 positions, then please fill out the form. And I should have realized then that there's something to this, because people spent hours getting that form right because they wanted to be considered. And then I went to the engineers at Motorola and said, hey, if I've got all of this data on these, from these 1,000 people, how do I connect that data to the roles themselves? And so we needed a search engine, and there was no Google at that time. And so the engineers there built a search engine, so we were able to query each of the data sets in there on the people. And when we needed to fill one of these roles, and we needed a redheaded, left-handed, Hungarian-speaking MIT graduate, we could query all of that data and see if we had someone like that. And sure enough, I would say to the manager, would you please write down the 3 people that you believe are absolutely the best for this role that you would like to fill? And they would write down the 3 names. And I said, I'll bet you that I can come up with at least 3 names that are as good, maybe better, in a part of the world and in a part of the company that you don't know, to fill this particular role, because we can use some data in order to find those people. And so we would query the whole database of 1,000, and a lot of times I could come up with 3, 4, 5, 6 people they never heard of that were a better match for the role than the ones that they had in mind. And that was an interesting insight in and of itself. Now, you can ask questions about my commercial instincts and say, didn't you realize that you were inventing something new that later became LinkedIn and so on? But I was interested in trying to help Motorola be the best at that point. So shortly after that, I then had the opportunity to move to Unilever, and eventually took up the CHRO role in Unilever. And here, this was the place where the insight about the demand and the demand side of the equation got much, much sharper. So rather than thinking about the roles in the hierarchy, in the top 200 jobs, we had a business problem, a big business challenge that we were facing, in that we had just recently issued a profit warning. We had a new team that was put at the top of the business, of which I was a part. And the CEO came and challenged myself, the CFO, and a consultant from McKinsey who was helping us at the time, and said, listen, we have to double the share price. So in order for us to be able to hold the business together, we needed the share price to move from 16 to 32. And then the question was, what are the drivers of that change in value? How do you actually get the value to shift from a 16 euro share price to a 32 euro share price? And so we analyzed the drivers of value, what made up the 16 euro share price and what made up a 32 euro share price. And so we could understand what in the base was working, what in the base was leaking, and what was really creating the value today, and what was going to create the value tomorrow. And that's where it started to come into my mind that we needed to convert these drivers of value into roles. And what were the roles, not sitting in the hierarchy, but the roles where the value is. And we started then to work our way through that change in value and also where the value was today. And we started to put the roles in value rank order. And sure enough, in a company of 300,000 jobs, 300,000 people, there were 56 roles that made all the difference in shifting the value of this company. And so, we had role number one was the role in the U.S. operating company. Role number two was the head of hair care, 3 skin care, 4 Brazil, 5 India, and so on. And you work your way through to the 56. And then once we had the roles, we looked at the starting lineup. And by the way, 56 roles is an American football team. Within a 300,000 person organization, here are high points of leverage where if we can get the right talent on those roles, it can make all the difference. So we looked at the starting lineup, who are the people in each one of these roles, and we realized that we had a mismatch between the value that was expected in each one of those roles and the talent that we were deploying against those. And when we understood that we had that mismatch, we said, well, gee, we don't have to disrupt the entire company. What we can do is let's get these 56 jobs right and see what happens. Well, sure enough, the value began to shift. And that insight about connecting talent and value at Unilever, has left an indelible mark on me. You fast forward, I decide my family wants to come back to the US, so I retire from Unilever and I join Blackstone. Now in Blackstone, you have 100 of these transformations going on simultaneously in each one of the investments. So instead of one large, massive transformation going on in Unilever, you have 100 relatively smaller transformations going on at the same time. And we began then to apply the connecting talent to value concept and idea to each of these 100 transformations. And we learned some very interesting things, and we got some reps in going about doing it. So I spent 5 years working on refining and developing these ideas further. And after 5 years at Blackstone, I decided to leave, and we founded CEO.works. While I was at Blackstone, I had the chance to work with and help find and place and mobilize more than 100 CEOs. And in that case, I started to understand what works. So after applying this 100 times, we started to see what is it that works when we're helping to shift investment outcomes through a CEO. And so that's the reason we called it CEO.works. And we were looking at talent and human resources and the whole human capital area through the lens of the CEO and driving value. And that became CEO.works. We began to get some momentum. And then I had the opportunity to reach back to my dear friends and now partners, Sumit and Shefali Salwan. And we have now refounded CEO.works. And we are shaping it and taking it in a direction that I'm incredibly excited about.